Chapter 9, Transition Period, 1853 to 1868. As always, we begin with the family crest that is important to this period. Here we see the Shimazu family crest, the Shimazu Kamon, which is of the katabami, or wood sorrel. Bottom of the page, we see the historical chronology, just very briefly, beginning in 1854. So again, these are the last 15 years of the Tokugawa period. It leads up right up to the Meiji period. So 1854, we see the second visit of Commodore Matthew Perry with 6 ships, Kanagawa Treaty with the United States. There'll be more about this later. 1856, Consul General Townsend Harris arrives at Shimoda. The Office for the Study of Barbarian Books is established by the Japanese. 1858, we see commercial treaty concluded. Keio Daigaku, or Keio University, is founded by Fukuzawa Yukichi. 1859, Yokohama, Nagasaki, and Hakodate ports are opened to foreign trade. 1860, the Japanese Embassy to the United States is established. 1862, we see the Japanese Embassy to Europe established. The following 2 years, we see the Choshu firing on foreign ships. The foreigners retaliate, and there are some various skirmishes throughout the country between the Japanese who oppose the barbarian invasion, or as they call it, and the Westerners who are seeking to establish foothold in the country. 1865, we see the imperial ratification of foreign treaties. 1866, the shogunate of Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the very last of the shoguns, begins, and in 1867, the very last year of the Tokugawa or Edo period, we see the end of the shogunate and the return of its power to the throne. The Meiji Emperor is enthroned. The end of isolation as U.S. black ships, or kurobune, arrive to demand opening of country, or kaikoku, for foreign trade. The shogunate is attacked for its compliance with foreign demands. Japanese enthusiastically adopt Western scientific developments. Trade agreements are established with US, Russia, France, England, and Holland. The movement begins to restore the emperor, the Sonno Jōi, as they will call it. The central government is formed with young Emperor Meiji as ruler. Okay, on the next page, we see this image here it's a sketch of ships of Perry expedition. Beikoku Shibetsu Perry Torai Ezu Shaseicho. Japanese sketch showing the 6 black ships of Commodore Perry's expedition anchored off the harbor of Uraga. Shasei will become a key word in the art and literature of this period. Shasei meaning literally sketch from life, as realism is imported in Japan and kind of overtakes all of the traditional modes of doing art and literature and so forth. Time of transition. Along the shore, temple bells and signal fires that had been lighted so many times before warned of the approach of 4 large black ships, or kurobune, flying a foreign flag. The United States warships commanded by Commodore Matthew C. Perry. The Japanese had been expecting him, having been notified of his earlier arrival in Okinawa. Ashore, Perry had little difficulty delivering a letter of greeting from President Millard Fillmore to representatives of the shogunate for delivery to the shogun. Perry delivered a second letter at the same time. It contained no overt threat, but it pointed out the necessity for a change in the isolationist, or sakoku, policy of the Japanese government, especially regarding the treatment of shipwrecked American seamen, who had often been imprisoned or executed, the opening of some ports for watering and fueling, and the placing of an American diplomatic representative in Japan. His letter further explained that he would return in the spring of the next year, when he hoped to receive an affirmative answer. Japanese authorities were certain that he was prepared to use force on his return, and they were sadly conscious of their completely defenseless position. On the next page, we see image 14 of the Perry expedition screen. This is another byobu, this time, a Perry Torai Ezu Harimaze byobu, it's called in Japanese. In this byobu, we see a red stripe around the ship at the left, identifies the ship as Commodore Perry's flagship Powhatan. Ships carried heavy armaments. The first treaty. When Commodore Perry and his squadron, now numbering 6 powerful vessels, returned to Japan, the Commodore and his officers consummated their mission with delicacy and skill. During the next few weeks, a treaty was effectively concluded, opening the small ports of Shimoda and Hakodate for limited trading and allowing permanent United States diplomatic representation. Other nations quickly received the benefits of United States diplomacy. Within a year, similar treaties were signed with Great Britain, Russia, and Holland. And this image 114 at the top here is the same one from the previous page, the Perry Torai Ezu Harimaze byobu. And here we see the officers of the fleet include Perry's son, Captain Abbott, interpreters Portman and Williams, Captain Adams, and Matthew Perry on the far right. During negotiations with the shogunate, the Americans utilized diplomacy by revelry. They wined and dined the Japanese diplomats aboard ships and entertained them with hilarious minstrel shows. The blackfaces, ragtime music, strange costumes, and dances seemed incredible to the Japanese diplomats, but no more so than the violent sumo wrestling matches featuring nude 300-pound athletes seemed to the Americans. Diplomacy by revelry was effective. The Japanese understood and reacted immediately and favorably. Toasts of friendship were offered in sake, champagne, and whiskey. With the signing of the treaty, Commodore Perry felt a great sense of accomplishment. Before embarking upon the expedition, he had put his views in writing, showing how high he valued the importance of his mission. When we look at the possessions on the east of our great maritime rival England, and of the constant and rapid increase of their fortified ports, we should be admonished of the necessity of prompt measures on our part. Fortunately, the Japanese and many other islands of the Pacific are still left untouched, and some of them lay in the route of great commerce, which is destined to become of great importance to the United States. No time should be lost in adopting active measures to secure a sufficient number of ports of refuge. To implement the Perry Treaty, which was little more than an amity agreement, the United States dispatched an astute diplomat named Townsend Harris, who was empowered to negotiate the first commercial treaty. By the time Harris arrived, an adverse reaction to foreigners had set in, but 4 years after Perry's negotiations, he managed to get the treaty signed. Commercial treaties were also finalized with other countries. All were highly favorable to the foreigners, of course. Over the next few years, they had unfortunate effects on the Japanese economy. The unequal treaties, these are often referred to as. The country became flooded with foreign goods. The outflow of gold to pay for increasing imports depleted the shogunate treasury. In addition, the treasury was being drained by the necessary construction of Western-style defenses, as well as indemnities for Japanese attacks on foreigners, which were becoming frequent. And at the bottom, we see another image from this byoba, the same byoba as the previous two images. Here we see a minstrel show, which was supplied as entertainment for Japanese diplomats, is being performed here, and it includes singers, dancers, comedians, and musicians. A combination of these factors, together with an inability to bring together the progressive internationalists, traditional isolationists, and the restorationists, led to the ultimate downfall of the Tokugawa Shogunate. Okay, on the next page, at the top of these next two pages, we see image number 115, sketches of things brought by the Americans from the 1854 book. Of great interest to Japanese artists and diplomatic representatives were uniforms and swords worn by the U.S. officers, as we see in that pic at the top. And on the right image, we see most impressive present that the Americans brought with them was the working steam engine, which is shown in detail in this sketch by the Japanese artist. And at the bottom, from that same unidentified image, we see tools, guns, and the telegraph were brought to Japan as gifts. Not shown in the image are the pistols, which became prized possessions. And on the right side, we see image with the inscription reading, "The Japanese were interested in camera and strange band instruments. Whiskey, wine, and cordials were happily accepted as well. Strangers bearing gifts." The Americans lavished a great array of gifts on the Japanese, items chosen with care. They brought rifles, pistols, and swords, a wide selection of potent alcoholic drinks, cordials, wines, and 100 gallons of American whiskey. The pistols and rifles were especially well received by the intensely interested and quietly enthusiastic diplomats. The Americans also presented the sending and receiving sections of the newly invented telegraph instrument, a collection of John Audubon's famous bird prints, and a copy of Webster's dictionary. The Japanese were greatly intrigued by the camera, the first ever seen in that country. They also showed great interest in the military dress uniforms worn by the American officers. The largest and most impressive items in the gift exchange, the one that excited the Japanese the most, was a completely operating steam locomotive built in miniature. With it came the necessary rails, tender, and passenger cars. After setting up this mechanical marvel, the Americans took the diplomats on their first train ride ever. For their part, the Japanese reciprocated with gifts to the Americans, all in keeping with their tradition of peaceful isolation, or sakoka. Among them were expensive and intricately woven silk brocades, gold and silver inlaid lacquer boxes and cases, and delicate objects of porcelain. On the next page, we see this large image of the Great Kanto Earthquake, Kanto Rishō Jishin, and this is housed at one of the museums at the University of Tokyo. The Great Edo Earthquake. A devastating earthquake struck Japan in 1855. Thousands were killed. Many cities and villages were destroyed. The population of the country, then approximately 30 million, underline that, 30 million is the population in 1855, was just recovering from the effects of a previous earthquake a few months earlier. Edo, the capital, was especially hard hit by the second catastrophe. Uncontrollable fires raged through the city, consuming the flimsy wooden structures and even destroying large earthen-walled warehouses where food was stored. The effects of this holocaust Holocaust were reported daily over a period of weeks in the newspapers of the time called Kawaraban. Underline Kawaraban, this is what they called newspapers before the word Shimbun came into Japan. It's kind of a proto-newspaper that was prominent during the Edo period, the Kawaraban. Usually distributed by bookshops, large sheets were printed by woodblock. More than 400 editions dealing with the earthquake and its after effects were printed. These papers, which gave the Japanese their first regular news, also reported such events as suicides, plot dealings with revenge, as well as natural disasters and battles. Rumors were also a favorite subject, and fantastic stories helped circulation. A great many copies were sold during the earthquake when the paper attributed the disaster to a sea monster. And in the inscription for this O Jishin woodblock print, we see on November 11th, 1855, a great earthquake destroyed much of the Kanto district. The crowded city of Edo suffered most. And of course, this will be a sort of precursor to the great 1923 earthquake that will destroy much of the city of Tokyo, as it will then be called. The second largest edition ever printed was devoted to a series of devastating floods along the famed Tokaido Road. Toward the end of the Tokugawa period, or Edo period, readers began a clamor for news of the foreigners in Japan, a demand satisfied to a degree by this early form of pictorial journalism called the Kawaraban. Okay, next page, we see the public baths. And here in this large image, women in public bathhouse, or Hayari Nencho Gyogi is the name in Japanese. And the inscription for that reads, inside the public bathhouse, women of all ages are seen. The bathhouse manager at the right is attempting to quiet a disturbance. The public baths. Cleanliness has always been a part of religious ritual among the Japanese people. You remember the word misogi that we encountered earlier, which is the ritual purifying of one's body or spirit. Every object used in Shinto ceremonies must be scrupulously clean. Outside each Shinto shrine is a trough of clean water, where the worshipper may wash his hands and mouth. It is probable that the passion for cleanliness among the Japanese has its origins in their Shinto native religion. By the middle of the 18th century, public bathing had become a social occasion as well as an opportunity to soak out tired muscles in hot water and cleanse the body by scouring with a rough sponge. Literally thousands of public baths were available, many of them catering to women exclusively, others only to men. In the great majority, washing rooms for men and women were separate. But after washing, soaking in the big hot pool was enjoyed by both sexes in some instances. I wouldn't say all of them, but some of the large baths in the city could hold 100 or more. In the country areas, natural hot springs or onsen were popular with bathers. Many people traveled to these spas believing that the waters of different springs possessed different creative powers. Some were believed to be good for bad eyesight, others for rheumatism, and still others for skin infections. Around these onsen spas, resorts blossomed. Many became famous throughout the nation. Okay, next page, we see image number 118, Townsend Harris meeting with representatives of the Tokugawa Bakufu or shogunate. After a long wait, we see Consul Townsend Harris receives audience with the shogun Iesada, the very last of the Tokugawa shogunate. This meeting led to the first commercial treaty. The patient consul general. The first United States consul general to Japan, Townsend Harris, was a patient but determined diplomat. His arrival in 1856 caused the Japanese almost as much consternation as Perry's 3 years earlier. He was first informed that there was no purpose in his being there, that the United States did not need representation. He was urged to go home. By this time, criticism of the shogunate or Bakufu for their acquiescence to the treaty negotiated by Commodore Perry had set in. The idea of a permanent diplomatic United States representative, which would inevitably be followed by representatives from other countries, was resisted vigorously. So for the next few months, Townsend Harris got nowhere in his efforts to meet with and deliver his credentials to the shogun. Evasions were ingenious and continuous. When he wrote to the shogunate, he was told that it was not the custom of the government to reply to the letters of foreigners. No one from the least to the most important official wanted to be involved. The Tokugawa shogunate was fighting for its very existence against the restorationists, and any advantage given to a foreigner weakened their position. Harris was, therefore, given every opportunity to give up his seemingly futile mission. His interpreter was assassinated, and he himself was often threatened. But he continued to importune the government for an audience. On December 7th, 1857, after the British had fired on Canton in China, and after the Japanese had learned that the United States forces, after being attacked by the Chinese, had retaliated by firing on the forts surrounding Canton, the shogunate realized that a continuation of their evasive tactics and further delay might bring negotiation by force to Japan, which is something they did not want. The shogunate arranged a meeting with Townsend Harris. Harris successfully carried out the negotiations, and on July 29, 1858, the final treaty was signed. It provided for diplomatic and consular privileges, including extraterritorial territorial legal rights, allowing foreign citizens to be judged by their own laws, and a fixed tariff at low rates, as well as the opening of a number of ports. Similar treaties were signed within the next few months with England, France, Holland, and Russia. All right, on the next page, we see this large image, number 119, Yokohama Fuke Ichidong, or View of Yokohama. The inscription for that read, because of its fine, deep harbor and proximity to Edo, Yokohama became Japan's most important foreign port. And at the bottom, we see another view of Yokohama waterfront. The inscription there reads, activity at the wharf in Yokohama Harbor shows commercial traffic moving in and out of the busy customs area. The trading ports. When the ports of Yokohama, Nagasaki, and Hakodate were officially open to foreign trade, their growth from fishing villages to thriving communities was rapid. Of the three, Yokohama, blessed with an excellent deep harbor and located close to the capital at Edo, showed the greatest gain in population. Custom houses, warehouses, waterfront docks, and residences in the new foreign settlement rose almost overnight. Soon the waterfront took on some of the aspects of such foreign ports as Hong Kong and Shanghai, as British and Scottish traders constructed houses in much the same way as the Englishmen had done in China. Behind high gates, foreign diplomats and traders lived, as nearly as possible the way they had lived at home. Only in the crowded streets outside the gates or at official functions did the foreigners come into contact with the Japanese. So they lived in Japan in increasing numbers, but were pretty much isolated from the normal Japanese citizens. Procuring food for the foreigners created a considerable problem. Much of it had to be imported, for to the Japanese people, meat eating was a vulgar and abhorrent idea which they took to very slowly. However, around 1860, the Japanese must have tried frying beef with bean curd, soy extract, and local vegetables, for such a concoction caught on and was soon known in trading ports as sukiyaki. Before many years had passed, sukiyaki had developed an international reputation as a typical Japanese dish. The black ships, and here this large image at the top, we see shipping by Western traders at Yokohama Koeki Seiyojin no Nimotsu Unso no Zu. And the inscription for that reads, the busy scene in Yokohama Harbor shows early travelers who come to Japan in the black ships in this transition era. After the signing of the trade treaty, many black ships, or kurobune, as most foreign trading vessels were called, were anchored in the treaty harbors. Merchants from most European countries, as well as the United States, were anxious to get in at the beginning of trade with Japan. The ports of Yokohama and Nagasaki were crowded with ships of all countries and sizes carrying traders, missionaries, although they were not yet legally qualified to enter the country, and adventurers of all kinds. It was a culmination of the many years spent by the West trying to open the doors to trade with the Japanese. The endeavor started with the English, whose attempts to open trade relations after Japan had sealed itself off were unsuccessful. They were followed by Russian envoys, Laxman in 1792 and Rezanov in 1804. Then the British came again during the war between England and Holland. The United States made two attempts. First came the unarmed Morrison ship, the Morrison, with a shipload of missionaries and Japanese castaways being brought back for repatriation. The Morrison ship was fired upon and driven off, but this incident probably helped in having the edict of Uchiharai, or drive the foreigners away, revoked. The matter was taken quite seriously by the governments of the United States, English, and Russia, as well as the government of Japan. The United States and Russia were especially concerned, for both had extensive whaling interest in the North Pacific. On numerous occasions, whaling ships and crews in distress had been turned away from shore or attacked when driven close to the Japanese islands. Long after the edict was modified, two United States warships under the command of Commodore James Biddle arrived and were well treated. Biddle requested that trade treaty negotiations be opened. The shogunate refused and the Americans withdrew. When the trade treaty was finally ratified, foreign ships sailed in ever-increasing numbers and the foreign colony grew rapidly. The Japanese were both repelled by and interested in the foreign ships. They resented the foreigners being on their soil, but had a great curiosity about the ships' fittings, their guns, their steam power, and the odd customs of these strange Western people. Next image at the top of the next page is image 122. We see the Russian ship and crew, or Jokisen Jinbutsu Taihan Zue. And the inscription reads, a woodblock print of a Russian vessel showing the ship as a sea monster. Characters of individuals are of the Russian crew. And at the bottom there, we see foreign trade houses in Yokohama, Yokohama Ijin Shokan Shashin no Zu. Fashionable European ladies receive curious looks from Japanese ladies and gentlemen as they enter the set. Reaction to the foreigners. The cry of Sonno, as in Sonno Jōi, Sonno revere the emperor, began to be heard throughout the country. As the reaction by the Japanese to the first traders became violent, it became Sonno Jōi, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. Jōi. Reasons for anti-foreign reaction were easy to find. The foreigners had no understanding of Japanese traditions and violated many of them. Another of the objections was that they bought up Japanese gold, causing a rise in the local prices. But the uprisings were not at all the fault of the foreigners. Thousands of out-of-work samurai, or bushi, trained to defend the isolationist traditions of their country, found not only the presence but also the customs of the foreigners repulsive. Some demonstrated their feelings by physical attacks. Others were content to ignore the foreigners or refuse to cooperate with them. Fortunately, most of their energies were channeled into the cause of restoring power to the emperor in the hope that he would reestablish their status and expel the foreigners. Jōi. Not all the reactions were unfavorable. Most Japanese were gracious, hospitable, helpful, and quite naturally curious about the old dress and strange manner of the newcomers. Next page, image 124, we have a party of persons from 5 countries at the Gankiro restaurant. Gokakoku Gankiro ni oite sakamori no zu. Foreigners representing 5 different countries watch as a Chinese magician entertains in a Yokohama geisha house. We see on the top right a Sunday in Yokohama, a parade of foreigners. Yokohama Dontaku no Zu. Parades by foreigners were frequent events along the waterfront of Yokohama and were often sketched by Japanese artists. Parties and parades. When the foreign settlements were opened, merchants, sailors, and soldiers attached to the British, French, Russian, Dutch, and American legations formed the nucleus for a distinctive Western Japanese culture. In early settlement days, foreign vessels came not only to trade but to refuel, take on water, and replenish their food stocks. In addition to the traders, many adventurers came to the settlements in the hope of making a quick fortune. One enterprising gentleman imported overland coaches, fully expecting to use them as transport to the gold mines. Because gold mining was rigidly controlled and there was no opportunity for foreigners to stake out claims, the stagecoaches were ultimately used on a pioneer run from Yokohama to Edo. Soldiers from the foreign countries, with few exceptions, were well received by the Japanese military and the residents of the concession ports. Foreign military bands were especially popular, judging from the great number of nishikie, woodblock prints. These prints, developed from the earlier ukiyo-e prints, were first created by Suzuki Harunobu in the mid-18th century. By the time the opening of the settlement ports, nishikie had declined considerably in artistic quality, yet the nishikie artists produced a vivid record of the contemporary scene. And here on the next page, we see a detail from that same Gokakoku Gankiro ni oite sakamori no zu. We see a close-up of that drunk-looking Gaikokujin standing there doing some kind of crazy dance while others look on and laugh. The gay dance is done by a foreigner in Yokohama restaurant. On table in the foreground is sake flask and fish called tai. And on the right here we see a sumo wrestler defeats a foreigner. Yokohama Homare no Shobuzuke. The Japanese sumo wrestler is defeating the foreigner. The print symbolizes the early reaction against the foreigners. Based upon these colorful pictures, it is apparent that foreigners in Japan enjoyed the food, entertainment, and company of the Japanese. Fish, ducks, and various types of wild birds were plentiful and cheap. Sake was readily available, and there were plenty of geisha ready to pour it. These entertainers specialized in dancing, singing, the playing of the shamisen, and companionship at the dinner table. They should not be confused with the oirang, or the prostitutes, who were attractive and available. Okay, the next image here is 128 persons from the USA. Kita America Gashu Koka. And the inscription there reads, an American displays his watch as his wife uses an early model of sewing machine. The text above them describes the situation in the United States. At the top of the page, we see an America Jinozu. And there we see an American mother feeds her baby while the father proudly shows his watch. Western watches, new to Japan, were very popular. And on the right of the page, we see image number 130, Dutchman with telescope. The inscription for that Dutchman with telescope reads, a dapper Dutchman using a telescope was imaginatively sketched by Japanese artists who elongated the subject and the chair in a kind of experimental style. It was in the field of entertainment that Japanese and foreigners met most easily. Traditionally taught to cope with any entertainment situation, the geisha soon charmed the visitors. In this area, there was no language nor custom barrier. Americans, British, French, and Russians danced, sang, and drank with the gracious and acquiescent hostesses. Because the foreigners could not visit the famous Yoshiwara gate quarters, or the yukaka, the pleasure quarters that had been established in the middle of the Edo period, it came to the settlements instead. Within and around the settlements, many Japanese adopted Western dress, or yofuku, although not completely, for Western clothing was very expensive. It was not unusual to see Japanese dressed in Western shoes, derby hats, but in the traditional hakama, so a kind of mix of the two styles. Artisans observed the work of Western carpenters, plumbers, and sailmakers, and were quick to adopt useful techniques. And the next 2 pages, on the left page, we see a Russian, Orasha Jin no Zu. The inscription reads, Russian soldiers, sailors, and merchants were frequent visitors to Japan. Above in this picture, we see a Russian riding a spirited horse. And on the right side, we see a Chinese on horseback near the Kanagawa. Nankin Jin Kanagawa Hama Mugi Atari Yokohama Encho. And the inscription reads, a horseback was an important method of transport in the 1860s. A Chinese man here rides near Kanagawa in a district adjoining Tokyo. And on the next page, image 133, military training using Western cannon. Taishō no Zu. And here we see soldiers of the Tokugawa Shogunate in feudal regalia shoot a cannon across 3 panels of this unique woodblock print. The end of the feudal state, end of the Tokugawa Shogunate, and the restoration of power to the Meiji imperial throne was forecast in events that occurred on the Tokaido Road between 1863 and 1868. The winding road stretching between Edo and Kyoto became unusually heavy with traffic when the Tokugawa Shogunate relaxed its authority, no longer insisting on the regular attendance of the vassal lords in the capital, Sankin Kotai, that we've already discussed. At the same time, hostage families were allowed to return to their own domains. For the next few months, a great procession of lords, ladies, and retainers traveled the road to their home estates. Following them came a high percentage of the population of the capital. Shortly after this, along the same Tokaido Road, came the 14th Tokugawa Shogun himself, the very last shogun, accompanied by some 3,000 retainers, a procession that was an even surer sign of the diminishing influence of the shogunate. For the shogun was on his way to consult with the emperor at the imperial court in Tokyo, the first time a Tokugawa shogun was to humble himself before the imperial court. 2.5 centuries earlier, a shogun had traveled east in triumph with a retinue 10 times as large. At the imperial court, the shogun succumbed to pressure by powerful lords close to the throne. When he traveled back to Edo, he was shorn of much of his power. The final downfall of the shogunate came when the important Choshu clan revolted against Tokugawa authority. The shogunate moved against the rebels, but the powerful Choshu clan, led by young samurai, was victorious in almost every engagement. During this period of minor battles, the shogun died. His successor, who would be the last shogun, not his father, this is the very last of the shoguns, his successor, confronted with certain defeat in the rising movement for a central government and restoration of power to the emperor, agreed to resign. This final shogun hoped, by stepping down in a graceful manner, that a peaceful way might be opened for the formation of a new government in which the Tokugawa could participate. But the dissident clans insisted upon complete supremacy over the Tokugawa, and they got it. After a brief civil war, the shogunate and vassals were compelled to submit to the rule of the newly inaugurated young emperor, whose regime later came to be known as Meiji. Soon, this Meiji emperor, with a splendid retinue, traveled triumphantly up the Tokaido Road from the old capital at Kyoto to the new capital at Tokyo. And here we have the final image of this chapter, the Suehiro Gojusan Sugi. Tokugawa procession leaves Edo. And here we see foreigners watching on as soldiers of the shogunate leave Edo to attack unsuccessfully the samurai of the daimyo of the Choshu province. All right, that's the end of this fairly long chapter for mere 15 years, but these are very important transitional years, 15 years leading up to the Meiji period, which we will discuss in the very final chapter of this book. I will see you all in class. Goodbye.